My name is Ammar Ziyad al-Najjar. I was born in Hama in 1970. I work as a blacksmith, making things of steel. I'm a secondary school graduate. My work was to get in touch with TV channels and some opponents of the Syrian regime and youth from Hama living abroad. They put me in touch with others, like the followers of Wahid Saqr and Abdul Halim Khaddam. They were in touch with Al-Ar'ur. They brought me instructions from someone called Muhammad Zakkar. Once, a group calling itself the Movement of Justice and Construction contacted me from Jordan. I took part in demonstrations in the streets. One of my workers introduced me to two men who acquainted me with Khalid al-Sheikh Faraj and Hamidu al-Hamsi. These introduced me to others living in Saudi Arabia, including Abdul Nasser al-Amin. In Hama, they introduced me to Abdul Samad al-Isi. Al-Isi introduced me to Attaf Turkawi. I concluded that Turkawi was establishing a general command for himself in Hama under the name of a coordinating body. He began by choosing one or two influential people in various quarters of the city. A large number of these was registered on paper with their telephone numbers and the type of their work. He divided them into media groups and security groups. Some had more important roles than others in the field of security. He took care of organizing them. My role was in the media group. I contacted channels like Al-Jazeera, Al-Arabiya, and Orient and arranged a cover-up to hide the sabotage and crimes caused by the security groups of Turkawi. Al-Jazeera channel used to contact us, urging us to speak about electric supplies. They contacted us half an hour in advance, telling us that they would like us to talk about children's food. The same person who made the preliminary call would call again on the same number, telling me that I am on air. They contacted me through the Thuraya telephone, which I got from Abdul Samad al-Isi. The security gang used to kidnap people and government and security personnel. Then we would claim that the victims were kidnapped by Syrian government security men.
There are reports about storming into people's houses in Hama.
Yes, storming and breaking doors and climbing walls. Large numbers of security men detained citizens who were praying in the Grand Mosque in Hama. They also detained doctors who were treating the wounded. Once Al Jazeera contacted me in order to speak about electric power cuts and attempts to prevent demonstrations in the city. We said okay. When they contacted me, I exaggerated the claim. They asked me how we took to the darkened streets without electricity. I said we brought light through generators loaded on vehicles. At that time, there were no electric cuts. We just made this false claim. I used the name of Abu Ziyad al-Hamwi on Al Jazeera and Orient TV channels. I contacted Al-Arabiya once. We told the Orient that there was artillery shelling targeting houses. This was our fabrication. The army had not reached the city at that time. A young man contacted me from the Emirates and told me that he was a follower of Wahid Saqr. He told me that they wanted to support us financially, but he did not give me his name. He instructed me to contact someone in the country called Abu Yamani on Sky B. He spoke about millions of dollars. This was a great temptation. They gave us names that should appear on placards among the demonstrations, like the Movement of Construction and Justice. I was only interested in money. Turkawi told us to speak about the money with any person whom we contacted. We wanted to buy weapons and create armed gangs. Turkawi received $13,000 in his account. I gave them another account number in the name of Miyassar Abdul Razzaq. They transferred $20,000 on that number. The money was meant to strengthen and support demonstrations with food and weapons. Turkawi began to buy and distribute weapons. I received 8 guns and their ammunition. Russian-made weapons were distributed in large and crowded quarters. Turkawi was well organized. Lighter weapons were given to the less important quarters. He got the weapons from various sources along the borders of Turkey and Iraq. He used to arrange interviews with Western papers. I gave an interview to the Washington Post. Most of our reports were false and fake, exactly against the reality on the ground. We claimed that we were starving. We claimed that we were under attack by the security forces. The armed gangs began their activities when the city of Hama was closed and when the popular committees formed by Turkawi erected roadblocks. The so-called security committees were formed by Abdul Samad al-Isi. They began to attack police stations, headquarters, and public sector companies. They carried out crimes of murder and slaughter. When the army entered the city, weapons were distributed to these gangs. Outside armed groups suddenly appeared in the city. Some of them had long beards and short garments. They had strong-built bodies. We discovered that most of them were from Jund al-Sham, from outside Hama. Some of them were non-Syrians. Turkawi brought them in. Whenever you went to see Turkawi, you found him among 50 people at least. He had a large web of contacts covering the whole city. The supplies included food with money wrapped in sandwiches. The sandwiches also contained crushed drug tablets. Drugs were also distributed to the armed gangs in public. These drugs encouraged demonstrators to behave savagely and to kill. Abdul Samad al-Isi was responsible for the distribution of drugs. We never knew about these drugs till very late. They carried out many activities in secret. Some drugs came from Turkey, and there were factories here in the country to pack them. The gang of Abdul Samad al-Isi was stationed in the War al-Bahra on the highway to Aleppo. He used to organize meetings in a public park there. He had his own prisons, weapon warehouses, and places of execution around the public park. He gave his gang special advanced American and Russian-made weapons. This gang was responsible for abducting anybody dealing with the state. After questioning him, they used to kill him and throw his body in the Orontes River. There were other smaller gangs. Abdul Samad had his own financial sources, apart from those who supplied Turkawi. He had strong relations with the Muslim Brotherhood. He lived lavishly, like a millionaire. He never told anybody when he wanted to carry out an execution. He only informed us later. Things got so bad that we ourselves became afraid of walking alone, lest we meet his armed gangs. One of his gangs was named the Ar'ur Security Gang. Abdul Samad used to contact us via Turkawi. He instructed us to tell the TV channels fabricated news about false kidnap operations. Any crime committed by Abdul Samad was falsely attributed to the state. We were brainwashed. The contacts coming to us from abroad claimed that the regime was finished. We were tempted with huge sums of money and promised to receive jobs, cars and houses. Many people believed these lies and promises. We were never told anything about the sources of the money.
Let's talk more about this now to Ali Hashim. He's a former Al-Jazeera television correspondent joining us on the line live from Beirut. Ali, hi there. You claim to have witnessed covert efforts by your former network to support the opposition in Syria. We have reported on this before. Bring us up to date, though, briefly. What did you mean by that? Remind our viewers.
Actually, as everyone knows right now, I resigned like a month ago, and that was because of the channel's way of covering the whole Arab Spring, precisely the situation in Syria and Bahrain. On each side, the channel was taking a certain stance. On one side, it was supporting and meddling into every and each detail in the Syrian revolution. At the same time, it was kind of covering up what's going on in Bahrain and not showing really what's happening. Here also we can differentiate between the Arabic and the English channels because each one was taking a kind of a different approach. But this was in general the reasons why I left, because there was kind of lack of professionalism, and at the same time I felt as a journalist that I'm really pushed to do my job for the sake of a certain state's agenda, which is Qatar.
Yeah, Ali, as a seasoned journalist, were you surprised by the scale of what appears to be happening here? How widespread were these efforts that you're talking about?
Actually, I joined Al-Jazeera by the beginning of 2011. The first thing I did was going to Libya and covering the revolution from the beginning. things were going on smoothly and normally. It was the first experience in such places. I mean, revolutions, because I've covered wars before, but not a revolution. But when we came back from Libya, and after all what we saw over there, it was covering the Syrian crisis, and here things started to be clearer and more blatant. So we went to the borders between Lebanon and Syria, and it was normal that we should say what we are saying. Over there, it was obvious that there were militants entering from the Lebanese borders to Syria and clashing with the Syrian army that was actually away from the borders like 3 kilometers. At that time, we were able to spot these militants, and we took some footage of those people. And later on, the channel refused to air these pictures, and I was asked to forget about these militants, and I was asked to leave the whole area back to Beirut.
And Ali, the channel was also, please correct me if I'm wrong, was also, I gather, helping the rebels, the opposition, get their message back to the station. How are they doing that?
Actually, there are several ways and means. By the way, everyone who has his own agenda has the right to do whatever he wants, as far as he's saying that he is serving a certain agenda. You're not going to say I'm a professional, I'm unbiased, impartial, for whatever objective, and at the same time you're serving an agenda. What happened that they were helping the rebels. It's what the government wants. It's what Qatar wants to enter some those vegans, some satellite communication tools and apparatuses. So they were entering them, smuggling them into Syria from the borders from Lebanon, as I knew from people with us in the organization where I used to work, in the media outlet that I used to work for. One of the people who was given like $50,000 at the beginning of the revolution to smuggle a so-called, they called a vegan, which is used for satellite communication in order to show the picture from inside.
Qatar's aggressive stance towards Assad has led to a string of resignations at the country's Al-Jazeera TV news channel. Those who left describe bias at the station, which they say has become a tool to target the Syrian regime. RT's Paula Slier is in Tel Aviv for us. So, Paula, tell us more about the accusations against the channel.
Well, we're receiving information now about the reported resignations of key employees in Al Jazeera's Beirut office, and they are claiming that the channel has a very provocative stance and has been involved in agenda-setting, biased reporting. These resignations include the managing director, the correspondent and the producer, and specific reports that we are hearing, particularly from the correspondent, is that Al Jazeera refused to publish pictures of armed fighters clashing with the Syrian army, and in addition also ignored a referendum on a new constitution in Syria. By comparison, the channel's coverage of events in Bahrain was minimal. It has practically ignored what has been happening there. In Libya, we are now receiving some kind of leaked information that the channel was involved in fake coverage and setups. And as you can well imagine, this is sending alarm bells to the international journalism agenda, because Al Jazeera was set up as a channel that was a mouthpiece of freedom and change. It was supposed to be a channel that was a revolutionary voice. But increasingly, we have heard critics say that it has become a one-sided voice for Qatari's government's stance, particularly against the Syrian President Bashar Assad. And our viewers, many of them will remember that almost miraculously, that was the word that was used by critics, last year Al Jazeera was granted a license to broadcast in the United States, and this is after it was initially refused such licensing rights. And this has led many critics to say that this granting was because of the channel's change in terms of an agenda setting, that it is very much pushing the agenda of the Qatari and Western governments that are calling for military intervention in Syria.
Well, let's look at another war that's happening, and that's the media war on this. And Professor Jasudovsky, let's focus on the role of this media, in which several reporters and producers of the Qatari government-funded TV channel Al Jazeera have resigned over the role that is playing in fanning the flames of war. It's been accused of this media war machine by its former reporters. Let's listen what this particular reporter had to say about this.
While latest reports have exposed exaggerations and fabrications about the situation on the ground, A journalist who only recently resigned from the Qatari government-funded Al-Jazeera over the channel's conduct has also accused it of telling lies about the developments in Syria.
The reality on the ground in Syria is different from what is portrayed by Al Jazeera. The reality is much different. The truth is now just an opinion of the director. In Al Jazeera, I can even lie to benefit the production.
This is not the first time Al Jazeera is accused of distorting facts about Syria. It uses Syria, the war within, as header of its stories on the violence in the country. This is while Damascus says many militants from other countries have infiltrated on foreign countries' behalf to fight the Syrian government.
Professor Chisadovsky, you heard the reporter there, ex-reporter of Al Jazeera. What do you think? It does sound like the truth is being skewed, doesn't it?
Well, this is, of course, not an isolated phenomenon, Al Jazeera. We are bombarded with media lies on a daily basis. As an organization committed to truth in media, our research center is confronted with that on a daily basis. When I started investigating Syria, that was in fact shortly after I left the country in March of last year, the first reports were totally fabricated, and we had to find documentary evidence occasionally within the Lebanese and Israeli press which confirmed unequivocally that they were terrorist acts right from the beginning, acts of arson, assassinations of civilians, well-organized brigades. And at that time, the media consensus was to say that this was a peaceful protest movement. And that consensus actually prevailed for quite a while. People were being killed by terrorists, and the media all over the world, and I listened to the Canadian media, the U.S. media, the European media, they were lying through their teeth. They were telling us that this was a peaceful protest movement, when in fact the so-called opposition were there with machine guns, and then they would twist realities upside down and say, no, these people who are killing are government forces, they're snipers, when in fact they were terrorists. So that it was an utter string of lies, of manipulation of images. They used the pro-government rallies in favor of President Bashar al-Assad to illustrate the resentment or opposition which was supposed to take place when it all started in Dara, which is a small border city right on the border with Jordan. 45,000 inhabitants. There was no protest movement. There was no mass movement. This was the initial process of bringing in the terrorists, and they were right from the beginning attacking government buildings, killing the police and the armed forces, but also killing civilians. And then what we have is this very gruesome media ritual of actually acknowledging the death of civilians and then using those deaths of civilians by the so-called opposition forces and then blaming the government. So that is really the whole basis of this responsibility to protect. You go in with killer brigades, death squadrons, you kill people, and then after that you blame the government. Special forces from NATO countries, not to mention Qatari special forces and intelligence operatives, which are collaborating with the so-called Free Syrian Army in terms of logistics, military advice, the supply of weapons, and this is in violation of international law because these are foreign forces on Syrian soil. The Syrian government has pointed to the role of Qatar and Saudi Arabia, but it has not mentioned the fact that there are British and French special forces on the ground collaborating with the terrorists against government forces, so that you can't have a ceasefire demanded by members of the international community, namely France and Britain, and have special forces from those countries on the ground collaborating with the Free Syrian Army. I should mention another issue. It is now clearly documented, even in Western media sources, that the Free Syria Army is integrated by death squads, which are involved in extrajudicial assassinations of people in the various communities. This was documented with regard to Homs. We're talking about assassinations. We're talking about ethnic cleansing directed against the Christian community in particular. Crimes against humanity are being committed by foreign forces which have integrated the Free Syrian Army. They are complicit in these war crimes.
Would call again on the same number, telling me that I am on air. They contacted me through the Thuraya telephone, which I got from Abdul Samad Al-Isi. The security gang used to kidnap people and government and security personnel. Then we would claim that the victims were kidnapped by Syrian government security men.
There are reports about storming into people's houses in Hama.
Yes, storming and breaking doors and climbing walls. Large numbers of security men detained citizens who were praying in the Grand Mosque in Hama. They also detained doctors who were treating the wounded. Once Al-Jazeera My name is Ammar Ziyad Al-Najjar. I was born in Hama in 1970. I work as a blacksmith, making things of steel. I'm a secondary school graduate. My work was to get in touch with TV channels and some opponents of the Syrian regime and youth from Hama living abroad. They put me in touch with others, like the followers of Wahid Saqr and Abdul Halim Khaddam. They were in touch with Al-Ar'ur. They brought me instructions from someone called Muhammad Zakkar. Once, a group calling itself the Movement of Justice and Construction contacted me from Jordan. I took part in demonstrations in the streets. One of my workers introduced me to two men who acquainted me with Khalid al-Sheikh Faraj and Hamidu al-Hamsi. These introduced me to others living in Saudi Arabia, including Abdul Nasser al-Amin. In Hama, they introduced me to Abdul Samad al-Isi. Al-Isi introduced me to Attaf Turkawi. I concluded that Turkawi was establishing a general command for himself in Hama under the name of a coordinating body. He began by choosing one or two influential people in various quarters of the city. A large number of these was registered on paper with their telephone numbers and the type of their work. He divided them into media groups and security groups. Some had more important roles than others in the field of security. He took care of organizing them. My role was in the media group. I contacted channels like Al-Jazeera, Al-Arabiya, and Orient and arranged a cover-up to hide the sabotage and crimes caused by the security groups of Turkawi. Al-Jazeera channel used to contact us, urging us to speak about electric supplies. They contacted us half an hour in advance, telling us that they would like us to talk about children's food. The same person who made the preliminary call contacted me in order to speak about electric power cuts and attempts to prevent demonstrations in the city. We said okay. When they contacted me, I exaggerated the claim. They asked me how we took to the darkened streets without electricity. I said we brought light through generators loaded on vehicles. At that time, there were no electric cuts. We just made this false claim. I used the name of Abu Ziyad al-Hamwi on Al Jazeera and Orient TV channels. I contacted Al-Arabiya once. We told the Orient that there was artillery shelling targeting houses. This was our fabrication. The army had not reached the city at that time. A young